Good morning, everyone. So today we start a series of lessons, of a series of 4 lessons on Rome and its empire. So the rise and the fall of Rome. Let's start from the beginning. Now, according to the legends, you probably heard, is around 753 BC. A wandering shepherd found 2 newborn twins, Romulus and Remus, being raised by a she-wolf in the forests of central Italy. He decided to raise them, and they went on to found the city of Rome. According to the myth, Romulus while Romulus was drawing the borders of the new city in the ground, his brother Remus stepped over them to challenge him and was promptly murdered. Thus, the city of Rome was born from an act of violence, and indeed the entire history of the Roman civilization would always be connected with violence and war. The Romans were a militaristic civilization whose conquers shaped the history of the world as we know it. Today we're going to talk about the enemies of Rome, and you will be asked to decide which one was the most important. In particular, we'll go through the following points: Rome, the Roman Republic, and the Republican Army. So the 3 things you need to know in order to sort of have an idea about what was going on in the Roman state at the time. Then we were talking about the North African city-state of Carthage, the Hellenistic kingdoms of the successors of Alexander the Great, the kingdom of the Parthians in Iran, and the Gauls. The final question of today is who were the enemies of the Roman Republic? You will need to describe at least 2 of the enemies of Rome, then explain why the army of the Republic was able to defeat them, and finally evaluate and decide, using your own mind, who was the most important of Rome's enemy. Now, moving on. Let's start by talking about Rome itself. Rome is a city in central Italy, you can see here in the map. It was founded around 753 BC, as we said, as a monarchy, meaning that it had a king. While initially it was just another city among many, by the 3rd century BC it had emerged as the main power of the Italian peninsula. From there, the Romans started a series of wars that led them to conquer most of the known world. The Roman state would endure and change with times, of course, lasting for 2 millennia. Let that sink in. The last emperor of the Romans, Constantine XI, died in 1453 during the Ottoman siege of Constantinople. In England, in France and Britain, the 100 Years' War had just finished. There were guns involved, and that's when the Roman Empire fell, okay, to give you an idea of how long it lasted in human history. If we consider that the Byzantine Empire and the fall of Constantinople as the last Roman state, then we can say that a Roman state lasted for no less than 2,206 years, which is quite a lot, and shows us the influence that the Roman state had, gives us a hint of the influence that the Roman state had in our modern Western civilization. This is a map of the Roman Empire. As you can see, it went from Britain all the way to Armenia and Mesopotamia. This area here in what is now modern Iraq in Mesopotamia were only part of the Roman Empire for a very short while. But all this from Spain to Syria and Egypt and the Balkans and Gaul, which is France, they were all parts of the empire for centuries. Moving on. Let's talk about the Roman Republic. As we said, Rome had been founded by Romulus as a monarchy, but the Romans soon kicked their kings out for abusing their powers and established a republic. Republic is indeed a Roman word, and it means public affairs, in Latin res publica, and is a system of government in which the common good of the state, the common good of everyone, becomes the responsibility not of the single king, but of the entire population. Everyone has to do their part. The Romans believe in these republican values that we have to do our part in order to protect the state and to make the state great, and also in the fact that since we are citizens of our free state, we have a special dignity. So the belief in their own dignity as free citizens of the Roman Republic was indeed one of the reasons of the military successes across the Mediterranean. They could be extremely arrogant, even in the face of other very powerful states, like the king of Asia of the Seleucid dynasty. A Roman ambassador went to him, insisted that he finish the war that he was waging against the Egyptians, and when the king of Asia was there, the king of Asia, the most powerful monarch at the time, was unable to give him an answer immediately, he just drew a circle in the sand around him and told him, you have 10 minutes to decide. If you step outside the circle, you are at war with the Roman Republic. The Romans could be extremely arrogant because they were extremely convinced of their own special dignity as citizens of the Roman Republic. Now, the Republic was ruled by 2 elected consuls who remained in office for just 1 year, so that no one could get too much power and therefore could become another king. Keep this in mind because it will be very important when we will be discussing Julius Caesar. However, the main decisions of the Republic were not taken by the consuls, by the 2 consuls that ruled the Republic, but by the Senate. Senate is another Roman word that means Council of the Elders. The word Senate comes from senus, which is connected with words like senility, senescence, and other words that are linked to elderly age. So the Senate was in a way the Council of the Elder. But while we generally tend to associate it to a parliament, it was not. It was not democratically elected. Okay? Only the noble families had the rights to sit in the Senate. No one else. With this system, with the 2 consuls, the Senate, and an entire array of other offices and honors, which I will not describe here, the Roman Republic was able, between the 3rd century BC and the 1st century BC, to conquer the entire Mediterranean within 2 centuries. One of the main assets of the Roman Republic was its formidable army. In fact, it can be said that Rome did not have an army, but that it was an army. Every single citizen had to be a soldier, if necessary. Now, not every Roman was a citizen. There were slaves, there were people who were not rich enough to be citizens, and they were not allowed to be soldiers. But if you were above a certain level of wealth, meaning that you had like your own house, you were supposed to be in the army whenever requested. Since being a soldier was a duty, they were not paid, and they had to buy their own equipment. They would receive a salarium, a salary, which was a daily dose of salt, at least at the very beginning. Then they would start getting paid, of course, much later on. This is not to mean that salt was as precious as gold in the ancient time. It was not. It was simply some extra thing that they got for serving in the army. Still, men in the Roman army had different roles according to their age and their wealth. There were the velites, who were the youngest and poorest and fought as light infantry, just running towards the enemy, throwing javelins, and then withdrawing. Then you got the hastati. They were young and they could afford little armor, and they should be on top here. And they fought like swordsmen in the first line of the army. Then you got the principes. They were the core of the army. They were well-armed, well-armored, and well-trained. They were the best guys for the job, but they fought in the second rank to intervene if the hastati had failed. You don't send the best troops in the first ranks because if they fail, then you have no one else, okay? You need to keep the tough guys back. And finally, speaking of tough guys in the back, you got the triarii, who fought as spearmen with spears, with long pointy sticks instead of swords. They were veterans, and they were the very best men of the Republican armies. They remained in the back, ready to push back any enemy able to reach that far. Unlike the Greeks, who generally fought with long spears, the Romans fought by throwing javelins at the enemy before closing in and getting personal with the short stabbing swords, the gladius. The Roman army was a fantastically disciplined force, which worked like clockwork when it came to fighting against any enemy, almost any enemy. This, combined with the fact that they were often fighting for their own country, at least at the beginning, and with the immense resilience of the Roman Republic, who was able to be punched almost to the ground by all sorts of enemy and then recover and punched them back stronger than ever. This meant that in the ancient world there were very few opponents who could take the Roman Republic in a fight and live to tell the day. One of these opponents, an opponent who actually didn't live to tell the tale, was Carthage, one of the earliest and most formidable enemies of Rome. Carthage was a city-state located in North Africa, in what is modern-day Tunisia. You can see, if you look at the map, it's very, very close to Italy, and this explains to Sicily, which is close to Italy, and this explains why the two cities clashed very soon. Carthage and Rome fought 3 devastating wars known as the Punic War, from the Latin name for the Carthaginians, which is the Peni. The Punic Wars have been described as a decisive struggle for supremacy over the Mediterranean Sea between the 2 rising stars of Rome and Carthage, 2 city-states who were expanding until they got into contact with each other. And Rome almost lost at the beginning, at least at the beginning. Initially, the Romans were unable to take on the powerful Carthaginian fleet. After all, Carthage was a naval power. Its power was in its fleet, while the Romans were used to just fight on land. The Roman solution was pretty simple. They made a device named the Corvus, the crow, that allowed to, it was like a mobile bridge that allowed to move soldiers from your boat to the enemy boat, transforming the naval battles into what the Romans did best, a good old-fashioned brawl. In the Second Punic War, the Romans faced a formidable Carthaginian commander named Hannibal. You might have heard him. Hannibal Barca was probably the best general before Napoleon Bonaparte 2,000 years later. Hannibal repeatedly defeated the Romans in battle. Ticino, Trebbia, Trasimeno, Cannae. Those are all the names of battles the Romans just lost tremendously, because Hannibal was an extraordinary tactician and he used the strength of the legions against themselves, or used tricks like ambushing them, as he did in the Battle of Trasimene. Still, regardless of all these catastrophic defeats, in which Rome lost about 1/3 of its entire fighting-age population in a matter of months, Rome was still able to bring the war to him and eventually win, and eventually defeat him in battle and destroy Carthage. To bring the war to Rome in the first place, to make you understand Hannibal even crossed the Alps, which are the tallest and toughest mountains in Europe, with elephants he brought from North Africa. However, as we said, eventually the resilience of the Romans, of the Roman Republic, had the better of him, and eventually he too was defeated in battle. After Hannibal had humiliated them so much, and after he had devastated Italy so thoroughly, the Romans started hating Carthage so much that they knew no peace until the city was completely destroyed in 146 BC. Now, moving on to the eastern Mediterranean, the Hellenistic kingdoms were the kingdoms set up by the successors of Alexander the Great in Greece, Anatolia, Syria, and Egypt. Together they occupied the entirety of the eastern half of the Mediterranean Sea and fought wars against Rome between 214 BC, the Macedonian Wars, to 30 BC, the death of Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. You might have heard of her. The Hellenistic kingdoms were probably not the most terrible military opponents for Rome, but they were still extremely important for the development of the empire. Greek scientists, we discussed them last time, remember the cultural revival, the cultural explosion of the Hellenistic period. Greek scientists and thinkers active in the Mediterranean, once in Roman service, once Rome conquered the land and started employing them, allowed Rome to develop its military by adding siege engines like catapults and ballistae and siege towers, and by making managing their army a much easier task due to their more advanced understanding of the economy, for example. Those countries were also incredibly rich, and the taxes they paid allowed Rome to maintain even larger armies. Finally, they did not give only technology and money to the Romans, who certainly appreciated that, but they also transmitted Greek culture and made it the dominant culture in the Roman world. As the Roman poet Horace wrote, Grecia capta ferum victorem cepit, Once defeated, Greece conquered its savage conqueror. If Rome had not conquered the Greek world, probably its culture and our culture, because our culture derives more or less directly from the culture of the Roman world, would be incredibly different. Now, moving further to the east, let's cross the river Euphrates and move into the land of Parthia. As soon as the Romans had finished consolidating the conquest in the eastern Mediterranean against their successor kingdoms, the Romans discovered the kingdom of Parthia. The Parthian state was essentially a successor to the Persian Empire and constantly fought wars against the Romans for centuries before their empire collapsed on its own. We will discuss what happened to the Parthians in a couple of lessons. In the first encounters with the Romans, they cleaned the floor with them, absolutely, at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC. The legions of Roman soldiers who fought on foot were surrounded by the Parthian horse archers who kept riding and throwing arrows at them and weakening them until the Parthian armored cavalry, the cataphracts, just charged in to finish the job. Later wars would be different for the Romans, who generally were able to learn a few things and started winning more often, but they were never ever able to advance further east or subdue the Parthians. The most they did was eventually just march into the capital of the later Persian Empire and destroyed it, but that would happen 600 years later. The reasons why the Parthians and the Romans fought are very complex and complicated, but we can mention one among many. The Parthians were the gatekeepers of the spice trade and of all the trade with the East. So, if someone from the Roman world, from let's say southern France, Italy, Greece or Spain, wanted to trade with Indochina, it had to pass through the Parthians, who became obscenely rich thanks to that. Now let's abandon the sands of the eastern deserts and move on to the forests of the north. Now, here we encountered the Gauls. The word Gaul is used, is a modern word, is an ancient word, but is used by the moderns to denote all the Celtic peoples who lived in Central Europe before the Romans. So the Britons who lived in Britain, the Gauls in France, the Celt-Iberians in Spain, the Celts in northern Italy, and so on. There were thousands of groups who spoke different but similar languages, had different but similar cultures, and they saw themselves as different peoples. But since we don't have time to discuss them one by one, and there's literally hundreds of them, we group them under the label of Gauls. Since the Gauls have always been very close to the Romans in northern Italy, they soon became known to them as one of the most dangerous enemies. Indeed, the idea of the barbarian that we have comes from the contact the Romans had with the early Gauls, in a way, even though the Gauls were not like the barbarians we think of them as. They were a very advanced civilization in many aspects. Rome fought against the Celts and the Gauls throughout most of its history, from the sack of Rome by Brennus in 387 BC to the Pictish raids in Scotland in the 5th century AD. The Gauls were known for being not only very brave warriors who fought with unequaled fury and courage, but also for being extremely capable metal workers. They invented the chainmail, and the Romans copied many of their technologies for themselves. So, those were the facts about the enemies of the Roman Republic. Again, I would like you to answer the question, who were the enemies of the Roman Republic? You have to at least describe two of them, explain why the army of the Republic was able to defeat them, and evaluate using your own brain who was the most important of Rome's enemies. That said, I'm looking forward to read what you can write, and see you next time.